Hi everyone, welcome to this Renewable Integration Study Technical Overview webinar. This recording is intended to provide an overview of key technical findings and actions arising from AEMO's recently published Renewable Integration Study, or RIS for short. This is the second session in a five-part webinar series on the RIS and builds upon the introductory RIS 101 webinar. In subsequent episodes, we'll delve further into the detailed findings of the three RIS technical appendix reports. To read the RIS publications or to view the other webinars in the series, please head over to the major publications page on AEMO's website. Presenting this webinar today is myself, Chris Davies, and my colleague, Barry O'Connell. For those of you that don't know me, I manage AEMO's Future Energy Systems team and had the privilege of being project director for this study. Barry is a principal engineer within my team and was the project lead for the RIS. So firstly, just a bit of background on who we are as a company, for those of you that aren't aware. The Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO, is the independent system and market operator for the National Electricity Market, or NEM, and the Western Australian Wholesale Electricity Market, or WEM, in WA. We also operate retail and wholesale gas markets across southeastern Australia and Victoria's gas pipeline grid. AEMO is 40% owned by market participants and 60% owned by governments of Australia. In the last financial year, we traded 213 terawatt hours of electricity, which has a value of more than 20 billion Australian dollars. Today's webinar and the Renewable Integration Study is focused particularly on the NEM power system, which operates on the east coast of Australia. In today's webinar, we're going to be looking at four different things. Firstly, what the RIS is and how it originated. Secondly, the scope development process that we went through for this study. Thirdly, a summary of key findings and actions for each of the main study areas. And finally, what these findings mean in terms of managing the transition of our power system. Okay, so let's get started with an overview of what the RIS is and where it originated. For those of you that aren't aware, as part of AEMO's role as National Transmission Planner, we published the inaugural Integrated System Plan, or ISP, for the NEM in 2018, which will then be updating every 2 years with the next iteration due out in the middle of 2020. The ISP presents a whole system plan that provides an integrated roadmap for the efficient development of the NEM over the next 20 years. Its primary objective is to maximise value to end consumers by designing the lowest cost, secure and reliable energy system that is capable of meeting any emissions trajectory determined by policymakers, whilst balancing an acceptable level of risk. The ISP utilises the opportunities provided from existing technologies and also anticipated innovations in distributed energy resources, large-scale generation, networks, as well as coupled sectors such as gas and transport. While the ISP looks 20 years into the future, the most recent results from the draft 2020 ISP indicate the potential for significant changes in the NEM by 2025. So to give you an idea of the magnitude there, this includes between 10 and 20 gigawatts of new wind and solar generation, and part of that, a potential doubling the amount of distributed solar PV that's installed. And it's in this context that AEMO established the Renewable Integration Study last year as a complement to the ISP. The RIS takes the projected future generation mix and network configuration from the draft 2020 ISP and delves in detail into the technical and operational complexities of running the NEM on a day-to-day basis, particularly at times of high instantaneous penetrations of wind and solar generation. It explores the changing needs of the power system, the challenges that are expected to emerge, and also the actions that we think need to be taken to support the changing power system. This RIS Stage 1 report has been about 12 months in the making, and I'm personally very excited to be now able to share this work with you publicly, and also really looking forward to engaging with stakeholders over the next sort of coming weeks and months. Okay, so as a starting point, we'll briefly walk through the scope development process that we went through for the RIS. Electricity has been generated in much the same way for over 100 years. The key study areas for the RIS were developed based on three major changes in the way that we're starting to generate electricity and the way that we seem likely to increasingly generate it into the future. The first key change that we need to understand is a change in location. And in particular here, the shift from large centralised power stations to increasing levels of distributed solar PV systems on homes and businesses. Historically, keeping the power system balanced involved the coordination of a few hundred large power stations at any time, whereas now, sort of at times of high solar output, we have millions of small decentralised generators dotted around the system. These are invisible to us as system operator, and we can't currently coordinate them like large-scale generators. So it's this trend towards high levels of distributed PV that led to the first area of study. The second key change is a change in energy sources. So the sources of energy from conventional generation are typically what we'd call firm. They're largely constant. So, for example, you can store water in a dam to run a hydro generator, or you can stockpile coal or gas to run a coal or gas generator. Whereas, fairly intuitively, for wind and solar generators, the availability of their fuel isn't constant and varies with the weather. And it's this increasing weather dependence that led to our detailed study on managing variability and uncertainty. The final key change is a change in technology. So the power system was built around the physical characteristics of large synchronous generators, so large electromechanical machines. Wind and solar generators, on the other hand, need a power electronic inverter to synthesize an output that's compatible with the power system. It's this technological shift from predominantly synchronous generation towards increasing levels of inverter-based generation that drove our study of system frequency management, and a smaller study as well looking at management of system strength. Finally, in addition to these main study areas, we also summarised a variety of additional challenges that are already affecting AEMO's ability to operate the power system within secure limits, and also need to be addressed to ensure that the power system continues to be operable. Okay, so as a baselining exercise, we started the RIS process with a review of leading international work to see what other large gigawatt scale power systems were doing in their push towards very high levels of renewables. We published that piece of work in October last year, and I'd highly recommend a quick look if you haven't already seen it. The figure on this slide summarises some of the findings from that international review, particularly giving a comparison of relevant large international power systems in terms of their geographic footprints, their network topology, and also two key renewable energy metrics. So the first of those is the percentage contribution of wind and solar to annual energy supply, and that's shown here in the orange bars. And secondly, the maximum instantaneous penetration of wind and solar in the red bars. So that's at any instant in time, how much electricity demand is being met by wind and solar generation. I note that the statistics here are for 2018. It's these high instantaneous penetrations that we're really most interested in and create the most challenges for system operation, and the driving point behind the focus areas for the RIS. So operating at a high annual contribution from wind and solar just means operating more frequently at these higher instantaneous levels. If we take a look at what we're seeing here, so in the red bar in 2018, the highest instantaneous penetration of wind and solar in the mainland NEM was 42%, so not far behind Texas, Great Britain, Island of Northern Ireland, and Oahu in Hawaii. What we found in the study is that because of the long, skinny network in Australia, a lot of the issues that we're facing are new, and the learnings from other countries are not necessarily applicable to the NEM. When we look at the state-based numbers, South Australia and Tasmania can clearly be seen to be experiencing world-leading instantaneous levels, which means that for parts of our network, we really are breaking new ground internationally. So building on these findings, our focus since October has been the series of studies indicated on the previous slide to really probe the overarching system limits that might exist in the NEM as the generation mix continues to change. What we lay out here in this slide pack, the RIS Stage 1 reports and the more detailed webinars that follow, is what we think is a really useful foundation of new evidence to help support everyone's thinking about future system planning and also future regulatory reforms. So we've seen what the instantaneous penetrations of wind and solar look like in the NEM in 2018. So if we now turn our minds to what 2025 could look like. What you see in this scatter plot is a view of the instantaneous penetration of wind and solar generation as a proportion of underlying demand, with each coloured dot representing a single half-hour period within a year. This is a really important graphic, and it's one we'll build on in the rest of this webinar. So we'll just take a moment to explain what it is that you're looking at here. On the y-axis of the graphic, we show the range of underlying demand in the NEM. And on the x-axis, we show wind and solar penetration as a proportion of that underlying demand. It's worth noting that distributed solar PV is shown here as part of that wind and solar mix, rather than being deducted from the demand side, which we sometimes how it's represented. The grey data set here represents the actual 2019 dispatch outcomes. So every half-hour period of 2019 in terms of the contribution of wind and solar generation to demand for each half hour. Being actual historical values, this data set includes all lost energy. So that's energy that's lost to network constraints, energy that's lost to system constraints, and also energy that's lost due to participant spill. And our definitions for those can be found in the RIS Stage 1 report if you're interested. What we see here is most of the time in 2019, the NEM was operating at below 20% wind and solar penetrations, a bit of time above 20%, and a few periods where for a couple of half hours we were operating at nearly 50% penetration levels. By comparison then, the red data set is a view of 2025 based on the resource mix from the draft 2020 ISP under its central scenario. So in this case, the data set includes energy lost to network constraints, but it doesn't show energy lost to system constraints or participant spill that are actually included in the main ISP model. So what you see here is the raw capability of that renewable fleet that could potentially be built under that scenario. In this case, for the red data set, we can see increasing periods of time where we push above 50% penetrations and potentially above 75% penetrations of wind and solar in the most extreme half-hour periods. For comparison, we've also included here the orange data set, which is based on the resource mix from the draft 2020 ISP step change scenario, again for the year 2025. Like the central scenario dataset, this dataset only includes network constraints, doesn't include system constraints or participant spill. In this case, we see there's enough resource capability to push the system up as far as potentially 100% penetrations of wind and solar generation for quite a few half-hour periods in the year. What's immediately apparent when we look at this figure is within the space of just 5 years, there could be significant potential change in the operating conditions that we experience in the NEM, even under the generation mix from the central scenario of the draft ISP. And what we've set out to do then in the RIS is explore the overarching system limits that at a regional or a NEM-wide level might stop the power system from operating at such high instantaneous levels by 2025, and also the actions that we need to take to move through these limits. That's enough for me for now. I'll hand you over to Barry, who's going to build on the graphic from the previous slide and take you through our key findings and actions for the 5 main focus areas of the study, starting with the integration of distributed solar PV. Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, Chris. I'm really excited to be able to share some of the key findings from the renewable integration study. The first area we will look at is managing the increasing penetrations of distributed solar PV in the NEM. From the international review, Australia already has one of the highest levels of installed distributed PV in the world, and this could double out to 2025. The first part of Appendix A summarises the challenges being experienced by the 15 distribution system operators across Australia. This section highlights the ongoing work and investment to adapt distribution systems to host increasing penetrations of distributed PV. As our distribution systems are adapted, this pushes the challenges of managing increasing penetrations up to the bulk power system. The second part of the appendix looks at the challenges of operating the bulk power system. The challenges are summarised at a regional level in the report, but for simplicity, these challenges are aggregated on this NEM graphic as the yellow zone. What this shows us is that challenges are already being experienced managing the bulk power system in parts of the NEM, especially in areas such as South Australia, where 65% of demand was supplied by distributed PV for a single half an hour in 2019. The first challenge identified is around the performance of these devices during system disturbances. Disturbances such as lightning strikes or equipment failure happen from time to time on the network. During these events, it is critical that generation remains connected to the system. What we have observed over the past number of years is that during disturbances, we see mass disconnection of these devices in response to these system disturbances. This is already affecting how we manage the system in South Australia during the daytime. And Action 3.1 to 3.3 in the report are around improving the performance of these devices to make sure they stay connected to the system during these events. The second challenge is around decreasing system dispatchability. As the penetration of these largely invisible, uncontrollable devices increase, the dispatchability of the system decreases. Dispatchability is particularly important during extreme or abnormal system conditions. In the past year, the NEM power system has had to deal with a number of extreme abnormal system conditions, such as bushfires carving up part of the network, some extremely hot days to manage peak demand in the control room, interconnector failures separating regions of the NEM for extended periods, and currently with the reduction in electrical demand as a result of the global pandemic. It is critical that operators have a level of visibility and dispatchability of the system to keep the system secure and in balance in normal conditions, but also especially during these abnormal conditions. Actions 3.4 and 3.5 in the report are focused on increasing visibility and curtailability of these systems so that operators have access to the required levers to keep the system secure. If these very achievable actions are taken to improve our distributed PV systems, we will be able to continue this success story, allowing more consumers to harness this rich energy resource. This is a much better option than having to limit new installations or having export limits all year long, even at times when such limits are not necessary. To learn more about this topic, check out the Appendix A report or the third part in this webinar series on the AEMO website. The next section we will look at is on increased variability and uncertainty introduced by the increasing wind and solar generation. We did a huge piece of data analysis looking at how this variability and uncertainty is changing over time and into the future. We also carried out a high-level analysis on the system's capability to accommodate this increase. The analysis shows that we start to run into challenges operating the NEM once solar and wind penetration goes above 50% of underlying demand. This is represented by the blue zone on the figure. We haven't really seen significant issues to date in the NEM, but we expect to hit up against issues associated with variability and uncertainty over the coming years as penetrations increase into this blue zone. The first challenge identified in the report is we see that the magnitude of peak ramps is projected to increase by 50% in the central scenario. Just looking at this variability from wind and solar is interesting, but it doesn't tell us the whole picture about the system. In the second section of the report, we include variability from demand and behind-the-meter solar in a concept we call net demand. This gives us an idea of the residual variability that would need to be covered by our scheduled fleet across the NEM. The main takeaway from this is that historically fluctuations in underlying demand was the key driver of ramping events on the system. Over the next 5 years, fluctuations in variable renewable energy will be the main driver in net demand across the NEM. As these ramps increase, it is important to understand the uncertainty and how accurate our forecasts have been at predicting them in the past. If we can predict ramps, well, then it is easier for participants and operators to ensure that the right resources are available to manage these ramps. The analysis shows that there are limitations to how accurately we can predict variability. Action 6.1 and 6.2 in the report are associated with the improvements to forecasting infrastructure and information provided by participants to aid operators managing system security with higher levels of uncertainty. The last section of the report investigated the ability of the future system to operate flexibly to cover this increasing variability and uncertainty. What the report shows is this is very dependent on the operating conditions and the decisions made by participants in the energy market. Action 2.3 is pointing towards the work that has been carried out by the Energy Security Board, which is looking at the 2025 market design. This work is investigating the valuing of essential system services such as flexibility and also the right mechanisms to ensure that the right resources are available at the right time. To learn more about this topic, check out the Appendix C report, or the fifth part in this webinar series on the AEMO website. The next section we will look at is on the challenges managing system frequency at increasing penetrations of wind and solar generation. The first challenge highlighted by this work is there has been a decline in the provision of primary frequency response on the system. This has led to a degradation in frequency performance of the NEM. Primary frequency response is essential for the stability of the power system and increases the resilience of the system to extreme events. Action 4.1 is related to the rule change AEMO lodged to mandate the provision of narrowband primary frequency response from all generators. This is essential to manage the risk profile of the system over the coming years. As the penetration of wind and solar increases, conventional synchronous generation is displaced and the inertia of the system reduces. As the inertia of the system decreases, the system accelerates faster for system disturbances. This means that there is a need for faster frequency responsive reserve to arrest this faster frequency decline. While faster frequency response is beneficial, it is worth noting that no large power system in the world operates without synchronous inertia, and the NEM is not any different. Action 4.2 in the report is around developing a frequency control work plan to build on the Stage 1 analysis. The first piece of the study is around determining and setting the minimum inertia floor for the NEM. The lowest the mainland NEM has operated is 68,000 megawatt seconds of inertia. An inertia floor in the order of 60,000 megawatt seconds is highlighted on the graph as the left-hand side of the purple zone. This is an aggregation of the synchronous units required to meet this in the NEM. The second piece of the frequency control work plan is around revising of the frequency control frameworks so that the correct speed and volume of reserve can be procured. This will enable the system to securely operate at lower levels of inertia and out into the purple zone. There are also a number of other pieces which we need to further investigate as we transition to higher penetrations of wind and solar. We need to define the appropriate rate of change of frequency limits for the NEM. We need to further investigate the impacts of distributed solar PV on our emergency schemes, such as our under-frequency load shedding schemes. We need to identify the limits to one-hit switched reserve in the NEM. We need to identify the regional requirements for the provision of reserve. And we need to work to update our frequency models to improve how we can simulate the system going into the future. To learn more about this topic, check out the RIS appendix and the webinar on frequency management on the AEMO website. The next section we will look at is on system strength. There is currently a lot of work looking at system strength in the NEM, so as part of the scoping process, we didn't want to duplicate any of the work that has been carried out. The Renewable Integration Study gives a high-level summary of this work and also gives some regional projections on declining synchronous generation levels. At a high level, large rotating machines provide a lot of system strength. Power electronics based on current commercial technology don't contribute much to system strength and actually require a base level of system strength to remain stable. System strength in the report is broken out into two categories. The first is around new connecting generator obligations to prove they can remain stable when connecting to the system. This can be particularly challenging for inverter-based devices connecting in remote areas of the grid, which are far away from synchronous generation. These generators are required to remediate their system strength and make sure that they can operate securely, especially in these weak areas of the network. The second relates to the fact that we need a minimum amount of synchronous units online to keep the backbone of the NEM power system secure. The blue line on the edge of the grey zone represents the minimum combinations of synchronous units required in each region. If action is taken to adapt our system, we could securely operate the NEM power system to this blue line by 2025. While it may be possible to securely operate the system at this point, it should not be underestimated the significance of this change and the learning and adaptation required to operate the power system out to 75% by 2025. The action identified in this section is really pointing towards the ongoing work to improve system strength in the NEM. The current review of system strength frameworks, which has been carried out by the Australian Energy Market Commission, the work on valuing and scheduling essential system services by the Energy Security Board, as well as the work that is ongoing as part of the Integrated System Plan to improve how we coordinate the provision of system strength across the NEM. In order to operate at levels above 75%, we would need to further adapt the system and to make modifications to the existing synchronous fleet to operate more flexibly at lower minimum generation levels, which would create more room for renewables to operate on the system. Alternatively, if we could replace the services provided by these synchronous units with non-energy providing technologies such as synchronous condensers or batteries, this would also create more room for renewables to operate on the system. The final area we will cover is on the operability of the system as the penetration of wind and solar increases. This section focuses on the key challenges we are seeing with the existing penetrations of wind and solar and the challenges we are expected to have to deal with going into the future. So really when we look at operating the current system with very high levels or high penetrations of wind and solar, the main thing is the power system is being pushed towards its minimum limits. What I mean by minimum limits, I mean the minimum provision of essential system services provided by synchronous generation, such as inertia and system strength are really the ones that stand out. The existing dispatch process for the NEM was designed in a time when we were being powered by conventional generators, and there wasn't a shortage or a need to explicitly schedule these essential system services, as they came as a byproduct of our energy production. Because of this, the market dispatch of the system that comes out to the operators does not include the provision of essential system services. This means power system operators have to intervene in the market and direct synchronous generators to remain online to provide these essential system services and keep the power system secure. The number and duration of market interventions is shown on the bar chart, highlighting the increasing workload on the control room to manually dispatch the system. In the first 9 months of this financial year, the AEMO control room issued 229 directions, and these directions were in place for 1,600 hours. Another key change to operating the NEM is the increasing complexity associated with changing from relatively few large synchronous generators, which are largely electromechanical and determined by the physics of those machines, to millions of wind and solar generators, which are inverter-based power sources and are run by thousands and tens of thousands of lines of code. This makes analysis much more complex to predict the behavior of those machines and hence the system. Actions 2.1 and 2.2 are focused on redeveloping the existing scheduling systems so that we can reduce the amount of work, provide better information to operations, and try and automate the intervention process so that we can reduce the workload in the control room under the existing frameworks. Action 2.3 in this section points towards the ongoing ESB work, where they are assessing new market mechanisms to value these essential system services and also mechanisms that help operators and give more certainty around how we dispatch those resources to ensure we can keep the power system secure in the future. Action 2.4 and 2.5 are focused on developing operational capability through expanding our high-speed monitoring across the network. This will allow us to understand the system behavior as we transition to these very high penetrations of inverter-based renewables. We are also expanding existing control room tools and developing new analysis tools that will support secure operation at these world-leading levels of wind and solar penetration. So that is a summary of the key technical findings and actions in the renewable integration study. I'm looking forward to discussing this work and developing our understanding of solutions as we push the NEM to world-leading levels of renewables over the coming years. I'll hand you back over to Chris, who's going to take you through how these actions fit together and what the next steps are for the renewable integration study from here.
Thanks, Barry. So if we bring all those pieces together, we end up with this final view you see on this slide here. Firstly, we've got the progressive overlay of system limits and challenges, which Barry's talked through and depicted by each of the coloured zones. In yellow, we have the challenges associated with distributed PV, which we need to start managing for wind and solar penetrations above 25%. In the light blue, we've got the challenges associated with managing variability and uncertainty, which need consideration for penetrations above 50%. In purple, we see the penetrations above which we need a heightened focus on managing frequency and system strength, driven by decreasing numbers of large synchronous machines online. Based on the generation mix from the central scenario of the draft 2020 ISP and the current operating limits of existing large synchronous machines, we see the likely penetration limit for wind and solar generation in 2025 being the diagonal blue line at around 75%. As Barry noted, at this point, we'd be running all available synchronous condensers and be operating the minimum required number of large synchronous generators down at their minimum loading levels. In order to progressively operate the system at these higher penetration levels, we need to have taken all of the actions laid out in the RIS Stage 1 report and also summarised by Barry on the previous slides. So these are depicted here in the white bubbles on the graphic, which indicate the penetration levels at which these actions need to be progressively completed, starting with actions to manage distributed PV and also to manage the operability challenges. Given the lead time on many of these actions, the time to actually get them through to completion, the recommendations in the report state that all of these actions need to commence immediately in order to have them in place in time to support the ongoing system transition. In combination, if we take all these actions, we think it could be feasible to operate the NEM with instantaneous penetrations as high as 75% by 2025. However, if all of the actions are not taken, we'd expect the various system limits would cap wind and solar penetration levels to around 50 to 60%. As Barry noted, if we look to the future and we look beyond that 75% line, we haven't identified any insurmountable reasons through this study that would stop us moving out into that grey zone and operating with instantaneous penetrations of up to 100%. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, on the whole, you can view this as a glass half full or a glass half empty story. The glass half empty view is that there's a huge amount of operational territory to cover to get to 75% instantaneous penetrations by 2025. And we really shouldn't underestimate the unknowns that we need to manage and the challenges that are going to need to be worked through to get there. The glass half full view is that we've got a clear path of actions that, if taken, could allow us to operate the system as high as potentially 75% instantaneous levels within the next 5 years. And really the exciting thing there is that we know what needs to be done, and we already have the technologies available to make that transition possible. In addition to the actions identified in the previous slides, there's also a number of other critical enablers that need to be considered in parallel. Firstly, need to maintain focus on the strategic network augmentations identified in the ISP, identified as being necessary to enable least cost outcomes for consumers. Secondly, given the pace and complexity of change in the NEM, we see a real need for flexible market and regulatory frameworks that can adapt swiftly and effectively as the power system evolves. This will be particularly important in the area of specifying system services, so ensuring that we're able to signal the need for and recognise the value of different system services as our understanding and the needs of the system progressively evolve. We need to be able to move quickly with those changes. Thirdly, it's really critical and fairly obvious that any costs associated with the findings of the study need to be tested and flow through, such that the value to consumers can be maximised over the long term. So that's a two-part process. Firstly, feeding the findings of this study back into the ISP, and secondly, for any of the regulatory reforms to be tested through the ongoing regulatory and market reform processes with appropriate cost-benefit analysis being done. Reflecting on all of our findings, both from the initial international review and the subsequent detailed analysis, what's really clear is that Australia has an amazing opportunity here to lead the world in demonstrating how to effectively and efficiently operate very large gigawatt scale power systems at very high penetrations of wind and solar generation. The geographic spread of our network and the weakness of some parts of our network means that Australia is seeing a lot of challenges sort of sooner than other parts of the world, and we're going to have to resolve those before other parts of the world. We're small enough and we have enough abundant natural resources that we're quite rapidly heading towards very high penetrations of wind and solar, but also we're large enough that the learnings that come from successfully managing this transition are really going to be applicable to other large power systems internationally. I think that's a really good news story. Okay, so where to from here? We know there's a lot of interest already in the findings of this study, and we are really keen to engage as broadly as possible going forwards. In terms of how you can get involved, if you're interested in more information about the detailed findings, take a look at the rest of this webinar series, and I'd also highly encourage taking a look at the reports. If you've got questions about the study or you're interested in discussing the next steps from here, we'd really welcome your participation in one of the video conference workshops we'll be running in May and June. And also, if you'd like a more focused discussion, please reach out to us and we'll try and coordinate a more suitable, dedicated forum to engage with you. Finally, if you'd like to provide a written submission to either raise any concerns you have with the study or suggestions regarding future work, we'd love to hear from you before the end of June. Details regarding upcoming engagement activities will be made available on the AEMO website, as well as communicated through our regular industry updates. And if you've got any questions and to lodge written submissions, please reach out to us at futureenergy@aemo.com.au. So that's it for this webinar. Thank you again for joining Barry and I, and a reminder to jump on our website and take a look at the rest of the webinar series if you're interested in a deeper dive in any of the study areas. Again, we are really excited to be able to share this work publicly and very much looking forward to hearing from you as we move forwards from here. Until next time.